Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. Let me begin by saying that for as long as I can remember, the ability to perceive spirits and otherworldly entities has run through my family like an invisible thread, tying us to the strange and supernatural. This uncanny sensitivity seems to manifest most strongly on my father's side, tracing back generations to my great-great-grandmother Esther, a formidable woman rumored to possess second sight. Family lore is rife with hushed tales of Esther's eerie premonitions, of how she could divine a person's secrets with a single penetrating look. As a child, I delighted in these stories of my spooky ancestress, begging my father to recount them over and over until I could recite them by heart. It was my father who first discovered his own psychic gift when he was just 12 years old. The way he told it, he had been exploring the dense woods behind his parents' farmhouse, following the erratic flittings of a blue morpho butterfly. The day was hot and still, the air thick with the drone of cicadas. As he pushed deeper into the green gloom, ducking under low-hanging branches festooned with lacy curtains of Spanish moss, a sudden chill prickled his spine. The hairs on his arms stood at attention, and his breath plumed before him despite the muggy heat. He froze, some primal instinct screaming danger. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, he turned his head. There, hovering between two gnarled oaks, was the translucent figure of a woman. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, high-collared and severe. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She stared at him across the decades with mournful, luminous eyes, her pale hands clasped before her. As he gaped in shock, she slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest before shimmering out of existence like mist under the sun. Heart threatening to pound out of his chest, my father considered fleeing back to the safety of home. But curiosity and a strange magnetic pull drew him onward in the direction the specter had indicated. Barely 50 yards from where she had appeared, he stumbled into a small clearing. Sunlight filtered greenly through the leaves, dappling the forest floor in gold and shadow. And there in the center of the clearing was a small, unmarked grave, a roughly hewn wooden cross tilted drunkenly to one side, the only marker of the body laid to rest beneath the loamy earth. That was the first ghost my father ever saw, but it was far from the last. As he grew older, he learned to hone his extrasensory perception, to attune himself to the subtle energies and auras that swirled unseen around people and places. His reputation as a powerful medium spread, first in whispers through our small Ohio town, then to neighboring counties and beyond. People sought him out for spiritual guidance, to communicate with departed loved ones, to cleanse homes and businesses of negative energies. He accepted it all with calm grace and a quiet, unshakable faith in his purpose. By the time I came along, my father had fully embraced his identity as a psychic counselor and paranormal investigator. Some of my earliest memories are of strangers appearing at our front door, their eyes haunted and their voices trembling as they begged for my father's help. He always welcomed them in, listened to their stories with grave empathy, and did his best to provide aid and comfort. I would watch from the stairs, my small hands gripping the balustrade, as he would sit with them in our cozy living room, holding their hands and gazing into the distance with a look of intense concentration. Sometimes late at night I would sneak out of bed and creep halfway down the stairs, straining to catch snatches of the adult conversations drifting up from below. The otherworldly tales I overheard thrilled and terrified me in equal measure, banshees keening in the night, poltergeists hurling furniture, shadow figures looming in dark hallways. My child's mind transformed them into delicious horrors, campfire stories to whisper to my wide-eyed friends on muggy summer nights. But it wasn't all second-hand supernatural excitement. I had my own brushes with the unknown, fleeting moments that hinted at the psychic sensitivity I had inherited. Objects would inexplicably move overnight in my room, my favorite stuffed animals arranged in a tidy circle on the floor. Ethereal wisps like curls of pale smoke would dance in my peripheral vision. And then there were the dreams, vivid, intense, and saturated with eerie symbolism. I would wake panting and drenched in icy sweat, the details already evaporating in the light of dawn. It all came to a head in the summer of 1985 when I was 9 years old. We had just moved to the ramshackle old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a behemoth of weathered wood and sagging gutters set on 10 acres of sprawling woods and fields. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, the night so dark and still you could imagine you were the last person on earth. To me it was heaven, a wild expanse to roam, trees to climb, and more freedom than I had ever known. My little sister Lily, just 7 at the time, was more hesitant about our new rural home. She missed her friends from our old neighborhood and the bustle of town. The country quiet unnerved her, the vast open spaces seeming more eerie than peaceful. She stuck close to the house those first few weeks, a small pale ghost peering out the windows. Dad, for his part, seemed energized by the move. He had a new lightness in his step, a gleam in his eye as he talked about the good energy of the place. Looking back, I suspect the isolation appealed to him, the freedom to fully engage in his unconventional work without prying eyes and wagging tongues. He could meet with clients in privacy, perform intense spiritual workings without worrying about the neighbors. I think it was that very isolation, that veil of secrecy, that allowed the darkness to take root. It began slowly, subtly, like a drop of black ink swirling into a glass of clear water. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Creaks and groans in the night that could be attributed to the old house settling, sudden chills that pebbled our skin, there and gone in a heartbeat. Lily, hollow-eyed and listless, pushing her breakfast around her plate without eating. Then came the whispering, soft, sibilant, like leaves skittering across a cold ground. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, the empty spaces in the shadows. I would freeze, straining to make out words in the white noise hiss. It never rose above a murmur, but it filled me with formless dread, a bone-deep certainty that the whispers harbored ancient malice. When I finally worked up the courage to mention it to Dad, he frowned, that familiar crease appearing between his eyebrows. He tilted his head as if listening for something beyond the range of normal human hearing. After a long, taut moment, his shoulders relaxed and he smiled reassuringly. "It's nothing to worry about, son, just the spirit of a little girl making her presence known. She drowned in the pond out back decades ago, poor thing. But she means no harm. She's just a bit of a trickster, that's all." I wanted to believe him. I clung to the comfort of his words like a life raft in the chilly sea of my own fear. And for a while it worked. Dad's calm confidence was a balm, his explanations a candle in the dark. We even gave the spirit a cute nickname, Abby, short for Abigail. Abby's shenanigans were unsettling but relatively innocuous at first. Lights would flicker and dim, bulbs burning out with startling regularity. Our milk would spoil overnight, souring in the fridge despite the cold. Doors would open and shut themselves, their hinges shrieking like damned souls. It became a macabre sort of routine, just another quirk of our eccentric home. But as the sticky Ohio summer crept on, Abby's tricks took on a sharper edge. Lily's dolls would end up arranged in disturbing tableaus, their glassy eyes staring accusingly from high shelves. Angry welts would appear on our skin as we slept, vivid red scratches like the marks of small fingernails. And over it all hung the cloying stench of stagnant water, the thick scent of the pond on a breezeless day. Through it all, Dad remained unflappable, his faith in his spectral abilities absolute. When I came to him in near tears after a particularly vicious nightmare, he gathered me into a tight hug and stroked my hair. "Abby's just trying to get attention, kiddo. Like any child acting out, we have to show her love and understanding. Prove that we're not scared of her. She'll come around, you'll see." I nodded against his chest, breathing in the comforting scent of his aftershave. I wanted so badly for him to be right. But deep in my young bones, an ancestral knowing whispered that something was very, very wrong. Everything came to a terrifying head on a sweltering night in late August. The air was thick and soupy, the crickets and frogs symphonic in the darkness. I lay restless atop sweat-damp sheets, the old box fan in the window providing little relief. Tossing and turning, I tried to ignore the uneasiness trickling along my nerves like icy fingers. The clock ticked over to 3 o'clock, the witching hour. At that precise moment, an ungodly scream tore through the house. It was high and ragged with terror, a woman's voice on the ragged edge of sanity. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was coming from Lily's room. I was out of bed in an instant, my bare feet slapping against the worn wood floors. I burst through Lily's door, heart lodged somewhere in my throat. My sister was sitting bolt upright in bed, her dark hair plastered to her forehead in lank strands. Her eyes were huge in the pale oval of her face, stark terror in every line of her small body. "Lily, what's wrong? What happened?" My words came out high and panicky, my breath sawing in my throat. Slowly, tremulously, she raised a quivering hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. I followed the line of her finger, a leaden weight settling in my gut. There, crouched in the gloom where the feeble moonlight failed to reach, was a shape. It was vaguely human in outline, but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long and its head bulbous and misshapen. As I stared in horrified fascination, it unfolded from its contorted crouch with a liquid, boneless grace that turned my stomach. It seemed to absorb the darkness around it like a stain spreading in reverse. Then, as if sensing my gaze, its head snapped up with a cracking speed that defied physics. 2 pinprick points of baleful red light glared out of the writhing shadows of its face, piercing me to the core. Malevolence and a terrible ancient hunger rolled off the thing in palpable waves, pressing down on my mind like the crushing pressure in the deep ocean. I opened my mouth to scream for my father, but my throat was paralyzed, my lungs seized in bands of ice. I could only stand rooted to the spot in mute horror as the entity slowly unfurled to its full, imposing height. The shadows peeled away from it like flayed skin, revealing pallid, grayish flesh stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Straggles of lank dark hair hung in a parody of a child's style, but it was the eyes that shattered me, crimson wells of inhuman rage and bottomless sorrow. No child's eyes had ever looked like that, held that fathomless well of despair. It took a single gliding step towards us, its movements jerky and puppet-like. That was all it took to break the spell holding me immobile. Galvanized by pure primal terror, I grabbed Lily's icy hand and ran, yanking her behind me hard enough to draw a yelp. We flew down the dark hall to our parents' room, literally falling through the door. Dad was already up, his face lined with concern in the glow of the bedside lamp. Mom, her dark hair tumbling around her shoulders, clutched the quilt with white-knuckled fingers. "What in the world?" Dad started, but his words cut off as he registered our wild eyes. The stark fear etched into every line of our bodies. "It's Abby," I gasped out. "But she's not right, Dad. That thing in Lily's room, it's not human. It's evil. It's—" My voice cracked and dissolved on a sob. Lily pressed against my side, small and shaking. Dad's face hardened, a steely resolve settling over his features. He turned to my mother, some wordless communication passing between them. "Stay with the kids," he said grimly, already moving towards the door. For the first time I could remember, real fear shadowed his eyes. It made him look older, more vulnerable. Just a man, not the unshakable pillar of strength I had always seen him as. Mom wrapped her arms around us as Dad slipped from the room, a sense of something momentous and terrible looming in the musty air. I remember the sound of his footsteps receding down the hall, the creak of the floorboards like bones straining under a malignant weight. The silence that followed was a heavy, watchful thing, gravid with unspeakable possibilities. 1 minute became 2, then 5, then 10. The night pressed close, a smothering black void hungering to consume us. I shivered in my mother's embrace, chilled to the marrow despite the sticky heat. When the scream came, It was a blade straight to the heart. High and agonized, it ripped through the deathly hush like a serrated knife. I will never forget that sound, the sheer animal pain and terror of it. It was my father's voice, but twisted into something raw and unrecognizable. Mom was already moving, shoving us behind her and scrabbling frantically in the bedside drawer. Her hand emerged clutching a small silver crucifix, the metal winking coldly in the lamplight. Lips moving in soundless prayer, she advanced towards the door, her entire body trembling like a leaf in a gale. And the darkness answered. A frigid wind howled through the house, rattling the windows in their frames and slamming doors with a violence that shook the very foundations. The temperature plummeted with a startling abruptness, our breaths pluming before us in panicked puffs. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking on grotesque shapes that gibbered and danced in the flickering light. The stench of rot and fetid water rose like a miasma, clogging the back of my throat with cloying sweetness. Despair crashed over me in a black wave, the bone-deep certainty that all hope was lost, that we were tiny, insignificant creatures caught in the maw of something vast and utterly malign. In that moment of soul-crushing hopelessness, as the darkness closed in like a fist and the unearthly screams of my father echoed in my ears, something shifted inside me. A small, bright spark of defiance kindled to life in my chest, a stubborn flicker that refused to be snuffed out. It was the ember at the core of me, the inherited strength of my father and his father before him, a legacy of those who stared into the abyss and refused to blink. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I grabbed the silver crucifix from my mother's numb fingers. Its weight was reassuring in my palm, the metal warming to my touch. I squared my narrow shoulders and stepped towards the roiling mass of shadows blocking the door, heart pounding a war drum in my chest. "Leave us alone!" The words tore out of me in a ragged shout, my voice cracking with the force of my terror and desperate bravery. "You're not welcome here, Abby, or whatever you are. This is our home, and you can't have it or us." I thrust the crucifix out before me, my small hand shaking but resolute. For a moment, the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears and the rasp of my rapid breaths. The shadows stilled, the unnatural wind dying as suddenly as it had risen. Then, like oil fleeing from water, the darkness began to recede. It peeled back from the walls and door, slinking away into the far corners of the room. As it withdrew, as the darkness receded, I caught a glimpse of what lay beyond the door, out in the hallway. My father lay crumpled against the far wall, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. Blood matted his hair and pooled beneath him in a dark, viscous puddle. For a moment, the world tilted dizzyingly on its axis, and I thought I might pass out. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the flutter of his eyelids, and relief crashed through me like a tidal wave. He was alive, badly hurt, but alive. In that moment, the last of the shadows vanished, taking with them the unnatural cold and the reek of stagnant water. The house was still and quiet, the only sound the ragged sawing of our collective breathing. I realized I was still holding the crucifix before me, my knuckles white around its silver length. Slowly, hardly daring to believe it was truly over, I lowered my trembling arm. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the acrid scent of antiseptic. Paramedics, police, a horde of grim-faced men in dark suits who spoke in low, clipped tones. Through it all, we huddled together in shocked silence, watching our cozy world come undone at the seams. In the end, there was no tidy explanation, no easy answers to wrap up the horror in a neat bow. The official report spoke of a disturbed transient, a tragic home invasion with an almost supernatural edge. But we knew the truth, a truth too dark and strange for the harsh light of day. In the weeks that followed, as Dad recovered from his injuries and we struggled to pick up the tattered pieces of our lives, I threw myself into research with a fervor bordering on obsession. Long nights in the library, poring over dusty tomes and faded newspaper clippings, seeking any scrap of information about the history of our land, the restless spirits that called it home. What I uncovered chilled me to the bone. Tales of settlers vanishing without a trace, of dark rituals and blood-soaked soil, whispers of a malevolent entity older than human memory, a darkness that hungered for the innocent, and threading through it all a familiar theme. A little girl, dark-haired and doomed, her tragic fate forever binding her to this cursed place. With each new revelation, the icy claws of dread sank deeper into my heart. I knew with a grim, unshakable certainty that our ordeal was far from over. The evil we had faced was merely a harbinger, a taste of the darkness to come. It had marked us, claimed us in some fundamental way, and it would never let us go. But even as despair threatened to consume me, I clung to the memory of that small, defiant spark that had ignited within me in our darkest hour. The legacy of my father's courage, the stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. I knew that wherever this twisted path might lead, whatever fresh horrors lay in wait, we would face them as we always had, together as a family, drawing strength from the unbreakable bonds of blood and love. Our battle was just beginning, but we would not face it alone. In the coming years, as I honed my abilities and delved ever deeper into the world of the unseen, I would find others like myself, gifted, cursed, bound by the eternal struggle against the forces of darkness. Together, we would stand as a light in the shadows, a bulwark against the hungry void that sought to consume us all. The road ahead was long and shrouded in uncertainty, but I knew one thing with bone-deep conviction. Whatever trials lay in store, whatever sacrifices demanded, I would never stop fighting. For my father, for Lily, for the innocent and the lost. I would take up the mantle passed down through generations, the sacred duty to defend the living from the depredations of the dead. I was a child no longer, but a soldier in an ancient war. My weapons would be salt and silver, sage and blessed steel. My strength, the love and faith of those who stood beside me. And though the darkness might press close, though the night seem endless and filled with teeth, I would never forget the lesson of that fateful summer. Even in the deepest shadows, there is always a spark of light, a glimmer of hope, fragile yet indomitable. And it is from these sparks that the greatest fires are born, the cleansing flames that chase the darkness back and remind us of who we are, children of the sun, unbowed and unafraid. The clock on the precinct wall ticked relentlessly as Detective Akira Tanaka pored over the case files. 4 months, 4 victims, and a city gripped by fear. Each body discovered in a different abandoned building, posed with an unsettling artistry, cause of death unknown. Her partner, Detective Zain Mirza, entered the room, his face grim. Forensics just called. They've found something. Akira looked up, a spark of hope in her eyes. What is it? They wouldn't say over the phone, we need to go to the lab, now. As they drove through the quiet streets, Akira's mind raced. This case had consumed her life, haunting her waking hours and invading her dreams. The victims seemed to have nothing in common, different ages, backgrounds, professions. Yet something or someone had connected their fates in this macabre tableau. The forensics lab was a hive of activity despite the late hour. Dr. Rin Chen, the lead forensic analyst, met them at the door, her usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. You need to see this, she said, leading them to her workstation. On the screen was an image that made both detectives pause. It was a microscopic view of a skin sample from the latest victim, but something was off. Amidst the normal cellular structure were tiny metallic objects glinting under the electron microscope. What are we looking at? Zain asked, leaning in for a closer look. Dr. Chen's voice was hushed as if she could hardly believe her own words. Nanobots, thousands of them, and they're still active. Akira felt a chill run down her spine. This case had just taken a turn into territory she never expected. As she stared at the screen, one thought echoed in her mind. Who could be behind this? And what were they trying to achieve? Akira's mind raced as she processed the implications of Dr. Chen's discovery. Active nanobots in a dead body? How is that possible? Dr. Chen shook her head, her eyes never leaving the screen. I don't know. By all rights, they should have shut down when the host died. But they're not just active, they're evolving. Zane leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. Evolving? What do you mean? Watch, Dr. Chen said, tapping a few keys. The image on the screen began to move, showing a time-lapse of the nanobots over the past few hours. The tiny machines were indeed changing, reconfiguring themselves into increasingly complex structures. This is unprecedented, Dr. Chen continued. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if they're adapting to their environment, even without a living host. Akira felt a chill run down her spine. Could these nanobots be responsible for the deaths? It's possible, Dr. Chen replied, but that raises more questions than it answers. Who created them? How did they get into the victims? And why can't we find any injection sites or other means of introduction? Zane's phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. His face paled as he read the message. We've got another one. Body found in an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Akira nodded grimly. We need to go. Dr. Chen, can you keep analyzing these nanobots? And please, keep this under wraps for now, if word gets out. I understand, Dr. Chen said. I'll keep you updated on any developments. As they drove to the new crime scene, Akira's mind was in turmoil. Nanobots that could survive and evolve after their host's death. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, yet the evidence was right there, under Dr. Chen's microscope. The abandoned church loomed before them, its spire a dark silhouette against the night sky. As they approached, Akira couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger and more dangerous than they had ever encountered before. Inside, the scene was hauntingly familiar. The body was posed in the center of the nave, arms outstretched as if in supplication. The victim's face wore the same serene expression they had seen 4 times before. As Akira surveyed the scene, something caught her eye. There, on the victim's neck, was a tiny mark she hadn't noticed on the previous bodies. She leaned in for a closer look. Zane, she called, her voice tight. Look at this. Her partner joined her, squinting at the mark. It was barely visible, but under their flashlights they could make out a tiny symbol etched into the skin, a stylized hourglass. What do you think it means? Zane asked. Akira shook her head slowly. I don't know, but I have a feeling we're running out of time to figure it out. As the forensics team began their work, Akira stood back, her mind racing. Nanobots, evolving machines, mysterious symbols. The pieces were there, but she couldn't see how they fit together. Not yet. One thing was certain. This case was far from over. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Akira Tanaka knew that she was standing on the precipice of a mystery that could change everything. As the forensics team continued their meticulous work, Akira stepped outside the church, needing a moment to clear her head. The cool morning air did little to calm her racing thoughts. She pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number she hadn't used in years. Hello? A groggy voice answered. Dr. Yamamoto, it's Akira Tanaka. I'm sorry to wake you, but I need your expertise. There was a pause on the other end. Detective Tanaka, it's been a while. What's this about? Akira took a deep breath. Nanobots, active evolving nanobots found in dead bodies. Does this sound like something you've encountered before? The silence that followed was deafening. When Dr. Yamamoto spoke again, his voice was tense. Where are you? We shouldn't discuss this over the phone. An hour later, Akira and Zane were seated in Dr. Yamamoto's cluttered office at the university. The aging scientist paced back and forth, his face a mask of concern. What you're describing, he said, sounds remarkably similar to a project I worked on years ago, a top-secret government initiative called Project Lazarus. Zane leaned forward. Project Lazarus, what was its purpose? Dr. Yamamoto sighed. To cheat death itself. The idea was to create nanobots that could repair cellular damage, fight disease, even restart a stopped heart. But the project was shut down when we couldn't control the nanobots' evolution. They became unpredictable. Akira felt a chill run down her spine. And now they're showing up in dead bodies across the city. How is this possible? I don't know, Dr. Yamamoto admitted. All our research was supposedly destroyed. But if someone got their hands on it, if they've managed to restart the project... He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. As they left the university, Akira's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen. You need to see this. Come to the lab immediately. At the lab, Dr. Chen's face was pale as she showed them her latest findings. The nanobots, she said, they're not just evolving, they're communicating with each other across different hosts. What are you saying? Zane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen's hand shook slightly as she pulled up a new image on her screen. It showed a complex network of signals passing between the nanobots in different victims. It's like they're forming a hive mind, she explained. And there's more. Look at this. She zoomed in on one cluster of nanobots. As they watched, the tiny machines began to form a shape. It was the same stylized hourglass symbol they had found on the latest victim's neck. Akira felt her heart racing. It's not just a symbol, she realized. It's a signature. Whoever is behind this, they're using these nanobots to send a message. Just then, Akira's phone rang. It was the precinct. Another body had been found, this time in the heart of the city's financial district. As they raced to the scene, Akira's mind was in turmoil. A defunct government project, evolving nanobots, a mysterious symbol. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. The new crime scene was different from the others. The body wasn't in an abandoned building, but in the lobby of a major tech corporation. The victim, dressed in an expensive suit, was the CEO. As they approached the body, Akira noticed something clutched in the victim's hand. It was a small device, unlike anything she had seen before. She carefully pried it from the stiff fingers. What is it? Zane asked, peering over her shoulder. Before Akira could respond, the device sprang to life. A holographic display appeared above it, showing the now familiar hourglass symbol. Then a voice spoke, synthesized, genderless, chilling in its calmness. Congratulations, Detective Tanaka, you're getting closer. But time is running out. For you, for this city, for humanity itself. The evolution has begun and it cannot be stopped. Will you join us in the new world, or will you be left behind in the ashes of the old? The message ended, and the device disintegrated in Akira's hand, turning to dust that slipped through her fingers. Akira and Zane exchanged shocked looks. This was no longer just a series of mysterious deaths. It was a countdown to something much bigger, much more terrifying. As they stood there, surrounded by the bustle of forensics teams and the flashing lights of police cars, Akira realized that they were standing on the brink of a change that could alter the course of human history. The question was, could they stop it? And more importantly, should they? The case had taken a turn into territory that blurred the lines between detective work and something much more profound. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the city, Akira Tanaka knew that the real investigation was just beginning, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The hunt for answers would take them deep into the shadowy world of cutting-edge technology, government secrets, and the very nature of life and death itself. But time was running out, and with each passing moment, the line between humanity and something else entirely was growing thinner. As they left the crime scene, Akira made a decision. It was time to go off the books. Whatever was happening, whoever was behind it, they had connections that reached into the highest levels of power. To uncover the truth, she and Zane would have to operate in the shadows, trusting no one but each other. Little did they know their every move was being watched. The game was far from over, and the true puppet master had yet to reveal their hand. The city held its breath, unaware of the silent war being waged in its streets, a war that would determine the fate of humanity itself. And at the center of it all, a detective and her partner, racing against time to unravel a mystery that defied imagination. The shadows of silence were deepening, and within them lurked answers that could shake the foundations of reality itself. As days turned into weeks, Akira and Zane delved deeper into the shadowy world behind the nanobot murders. Their investigation led them to a hidden laboratory beneath the city, where they discovered the truth was far more complex than they had imagined. Dr. Kazuo Ishikawa, once a brilliant scientist on Project Lazarus, had gone rogue. Convinced that humanity was on the brink of self-destruction, he had continued his work in secret, pushing the boundaries of nanotechnology beyond anything previously conceived. In a tense confrontation, Dr. Ishikawa revealed his ultimate plan. "These deaths were just tests," he explained, his eyes gleaming with a fervent light. "The nanobots are ready. Soon they'll be released into the water supply, spreading to every person in the city. We will evolve beyond our fragile human forms, becoming something greater, immortal." Akira and Zane realized they were racing against time. As they fought to stop Ishikawa's plan, they uncovered a network of conspirators reaching into the highest levels of government and industry. The final showdown took place in the city's main water treatment plant. As Ishikawa prepared to release his nanobots, Akira and Zane, backed by a loyal team of officers, staged a desperate raid. In the chaos that ensued, Zane was injured, taking a bullet meant for Akira. As she knelt beside her partner, Akira faced a terrible choice. Ishikawa offered her a vial of advanced nanobots, promising they could save Zane's life. "Join us," Ishikawa urged. "Be part of the new world we're creating." For a moment Akira wavered, but then she saw the fear in Zane's eyes, reflecting her own doubts about the ethics of Ishikawa's vision. With a heavy heart, Akira made her decision. She smashed the vial and moved to disable the nanobot release mechanism. "Our humanity, with all its flaws, is what makes us who we are," she told Ishikawa. "We're not ready for your new world." In the end, Ishikawa was apprehended, his plan foiled, but the victory came at a cost. Zane survived but was left with a permanent injury, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. As the case closed, Akira knew that the world had changed. The existence of this technology could not be kept secret forever. Society would have to grapple with the implications of nanobots and the power they represented. Months later, as Akira stood on her balcony watching the city lights, she reflected on the case that had changed her life. The shadows of silence had been broken, but new questions loomed on the horizon. How would humanity handle the power to reshape life itself? Only time would tell. For now, Akira took comfort in the small victories. Lives saved, a partner recovered, a city still human. Whatever the future held, she would face it with the same determination that had seen her through the darkest days of the investigation. My name is Penelope Ashworth, and this is the tale of how I discovered that the most terrifying things often hide in plain sight. I've always been a bit of an outsider. When you move as often as I do, it's hard to put down roots. My father, Rupert Ashworth, works for the British Home Office, and his job requires us to relocate every few months. It's just been the three of us, Dad, Mom, Victoria, and me, along with our 3 cats, constantly on the move across England. Our latest move brought us to a small, misty town in Yorkshire. The house assigned to us this time was different from the others. As we pulled up the gravel driveway, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The house loomed before us, a Victorian monstrosity of red brick and dark windows. It seemed to watch us as we approached, its presence oppressive and unwelcoming. "What do you think, Penelope?" Mom asked, her voice wavering slightly. It's interesting, I managed, trying to hide my unease. Are you sure it's safe, Dad? Dad's laugh sounded hollow in the still air. Of course, darling. It's old but sturdy, renovated just a few years ago. As we crossed the threshold, a gust of cold air rushed past us, carrying the musty scent of age and secrets. The floorboards creaked ominously under our feet, and I could have sworn I heard whispers echoing from the shadowy corners. That first night, as I lay in my new bed unable to sleep, I heard it, a soft rhythmic sound like labored breathing. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves. I pulled the covers over my head, telling myself it was just the wind, or the house settling. But deep down I knew it was something else. Days passed and strange occurrences became the norm. Objects would move when no one was looking. Cold spots appeared randomly throughout the house, and sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures darting just out of sight. My parents dismissed my concerns, attributing everything to an overactive imagination. But I knew better. This house was hiding something, and I was determined to uncover its secrets. I began researching the history of the house. In the local library, I discovered old newspapers that spoke of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena associated with our new home. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Graves, watched me with knowing eyes as I pored over the articles. "Be careful, child," she whispered one day, her gnarled hand gripping my arm. "Some secrets are best left buried." Her warning only fueled my curiosity. I started exploring the house at night, armed with a flashlight and a determination to uncover the truth. The breathing sound continued, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible, but always present. One night, as I crept down the hallway, I saw a figure at the end of the corridor. It was tall and misty, with no discernible features. My heart pounding, I called out, "Who's there?" The figure turned and rushed towards me. I screamed and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut. The next morning, my parents found deep scratches on the outside of my door. They couldn't dismiss this. We called in a local paranormal investigator, a gruff man named Hector Blackwood. He spent a night in the house setting up cameras and recording devices. The next morning, he was pale and shaken. "There's something here," he said, his voice trembling, "something old and angry. You need to leave this house now." But we couldn't leave. Dad's job required us to stay, and we had nowhere else to go. So we lived with the terror, the constant feeling of being watched, the nightly sounds of breathing and scratching. It all came to a head one stormy Friday night. My parents had gone to a dinner party, leaving me alone in the house. The wind howled outside, rain lashing against the windows, and beneath it all, I could hear the breathing louder than ever. Determined to face my fears once and for all, I grabbed my flashlight and began to search the house. The breathing led me to the kitchen. As I pushed open the door, the sound grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight beam danced across the room, illuminating nothing but ordinary kitchen appliances. The breathing was deafening now, filling my ears, making it hard to think. And then, suddenly I saw it. There, by the kitchen door, sat my new pair of trainers, the ones with the fancy air cushions in the soles. As I watched, transfixed, I noticed a small tear in the side of one shoe. With each gust of wind that sneaked under the door, air was pushed in and out of the shoe, creating the exact hiss sound that had terrified me for weeks. I stood there for a moment, my mind struggling to process this revelation. Then, all at once, the absurdity of the situation hit me. I burst out laughing, the sound of my giggles echoing through the silent house. All this time, the ghost had been nothing more than a leaky shoe. The moving objects, probably the cats, the cold spots, drafts in an old house, and the figure I'd seen, most likely a trick of the light, amplified by my fear and imagination. As I sat on the kitchen floor, still giggling at my own foolishness, I realized something important. Sometimes the things that scare us the most have the simplest explanations, and sometimes a haunted house is just a house with a pair of very noisy shoes. The next day I told my parents everything. We all had a good laugh, and Dad even called Mr. Blackwood to explain. The paranormal investigator was skeptical at first, but after seeing and hearing the shoes for himself, he too saw the humor in the situation. We still live in that old Victorian house in Yorkshire. It's no longer scary, though it does still creak and groan. But now, when I hear strange noises in the night, I don't reach for my flashlight. Instead, I check my shoes. After all, you never know when a simple pair of shoes might decide to play ghost. I never wanted to be a hero. That's the first thing you should understand about this story. What happened in those woods, what I saw, and what I did, none of it came from a desire for adventure or glory. It came from necessity, from survival, and from a lifetime of choices that led me to that moment, without my even realizing it. Let me start with why I was there in the first place. My father, Michael Thompson, was a forest ranger in one of Jamaica's largest national parks. He spent his days tracking wildlife, maintaining trails, and keeping poachers at bay. But what he really did, his true calling, was collecting stories. Every village he visited, every old-timer he met, every remote cabin he checked on, they all had tales to tell. Stories about the deep woods, about things that couldn't be explained, about shadows that moved wrong and sounds that shouldn't exist. I grew up on these stories, drinking them in like mother's milk. While other kids my age were watching cartoons and playing video games, I was sitting at our kitchen table listening to Dad and his ranger friends trade tales over rum and cigarettes. Mom would hover in the background, pretending to be busy with dishes or laundry. But I could see her listening too, her hands still as the stories unfolded. "The forest has old magic," Dad would say, his voice dropping low as the night grew deep. "Older than the Spanish, older than the Arawaks, things that were here before people, things that will be here after we're gone." He never said these things during the day, never spoke of them in the harsh light of morning, but at night, with the jungle sounds pressing against our windows and the moon casting strange shadows, then the truth would come out. I was born small, still am, really. 5'3" isn't exactly intimidating, especially for someone who spent their childhood dreaming of following in their father's footsteps. But what I lacked in size, I made up for in determination. By age 8, I could identify more local plants than most adults. By 10, I could track animals through the underbrush, reading signs that most people wouldn't even notice. And by 12, I could handle Dad's old double-barrel shotgun like I was born with it in my hands. That last skill came from Uncle Marcus. He wasn't really my uncle. In Jamaica, any close family friend becomes an uncle or aunt eventually. Marcus had served in the military before becoming a ranger alongside my father. He was the one who taught me that the forest wasn't just beautiful, it was dangerous. "Beauty and danger," he'd say, watching me practice with the shotgun. "They're two sides of the same coin out here. The most beautiful spots are often the most deadly. That's why you need to be ready, always ready." I didn't understand what he meant back then. How could I? I was just a kid playing at being grown up, thinking I knew everything there was to know about the woods because I could name the trees and track the animals. I didn't understand that there were things in the forest that didn't leave tracks, things that couldn't be named. The weekend everything changed started normally enough. It was October, and I'd just turned 14 the month before. Dad had promised me a special camping trip for my birthday. Just him, me, Uncle Marcus, and the deep woods. Mom wasn't happy about it. Looking back, I wonder if she knew something was wrong. She'd grown up in these mountains too, after all. Maybe she could sense what was coming. "It's too far," she argued the night before we left. "That area, people don't go there anymore." "It's just stories," Dad assured her, but I noticed he packed extra ammunition anyway. I should have paid more attention to their argument. Should have wondered why Mom, who had never objected to our camping trips before, was so worried about this one. Should have asked why people "Don't go there anymore." But I was 14 and invincible, and stupid with excitement about finally being allowed to visit the deep woods where Dad's best stories came from. The preparation for the trip was different too, though I didn't realize it at the time. Usually Dad was casual about our camping gear. We'd throw some supplies in bags, grab the basics, and head out. But this time he checked everything 3 times. Extra flashlights with fresh batteries, multiple first aid kits, more food than we could possibly eat in a weekend, a satellite phone that I'd never seen him carry before. Uncle Marcus arrived early that Saturday morning, and I immediately noticed something was off. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept. When he hugged me hello, I felt him slip something into my pocket, a small leather pouch that smelled strongly of herbs. "Keep it with you," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't lose it." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but Mom called us in for breakfast, and the moment was lost. We ate quickly, Dad and Uncle Marcus exchanging glances that I couldn't interpret. Mom kept finding reasons to delay our departure. One more check of the supplies, one more weather report, one more hug goodbye. Finally, around mid-morning, we loaded up Dad's old truck and headed out. The drive took us away from the tourist areas, away from the beaches and resorts that most people think of when they think of Jamaica. We drove into the real Jamaica, the old Jamaica, where the mountains rise up like the backbone of some ancient beast, and the forests hold secrets older than history. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that barely deserved to be called roads at all. We passed smaller and smaller villages, until even those disappeared. The forest pressed in closer on both sides, the trees growing taller and older the further we went. Uncle Marcus was unusually quiet during the drive, studying an old map that looked like it had been folded and refolded 1,000 times. It wasn't one of the standard ranger maps I was used to seeing. This one was hand-drawn, with annotations in faded ink that I couldn't read. "Where did you get that map?" I asked, leaning forward from the back seat. He quickly folded it away. "From an old hunter, someone who knows these woods better than anyone alive." "New," Dad corrected quietly. "He passed last month." Something in the way they said this made me shiver, despite the warm Caribbean air. It felt like they were talking about more than just a dead hunter, but when I tried to ask more questions, they changed the subject. After about an hour and a half of driving, we reached a point where even the dirt track ended. Dad parked the truck in a small clearing, and we started unloading our gear. The forest here felt different from any I'd been in before. The trees were enormous, their trunks wider than our truck, their canopy so thick that only occasional shafts of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was different too, thicker somehow, with an unfamiliar sweetness that made my nose twitch. As we shouldered our packs and started walking, I noticed something else strange. Despite the size and age of the forest, there were very few animal sounds. No birds calling, no monkeys chattering in the trees. Even the usual buzz of insects seemed muted. "Why is it so quiet?" I asked. "Animals know things we don't," Uncle Marcus replied cryptically. "They know when to stay away." I wanted to ask what they were staying away from, but something in his tone made me hold my tongue. Instead, I gripped the strap of my backpack tighter and tried to focus on the path ahead. We hiked for several hours, following what seemed to be an old trail, though it was so overgrown it was barely visible. Uncle Marcus led the way, occasionally consulting his mysterious map. Dad brought up the rear, and I noticed he kept the shotgun in his hands rather than slung over his shoulder as usual. Around mid-afternoon, we came across a stream that cut through the forest like a silver ribbon. The water was crystal clear, running over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. Under normal circumstances, finding such a perfect water source would have been cause for celebration. But when I moved toward it, eager to refill my water bottle, Uncle Marcus grabbed my arm. "Not this one," he said quietly. "We'll find another." I looked at the stream again, and this time I noticed what had made him hesitant. Despite the clear water and perfect location, there were no signs of life around it. No fish darting beneath the surface, no plants growing along its banks. The rocks, while smooth, had an odd color to them, almost like old bone. We moved on, but that stream marked a change in our journey. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer together. Their branches began to twist in strange ways, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The sweet smell in the air grew stronger, taking on an undertone of decay that made my stomach turn. By 4:30 p.m., we needed to make camp. The light was already beginning to fade under the thick canopy, and there was an unspoken agreement that we didn't want to be moving after dark. We found a small clearing that seemed suitable, though nothing about it felt right to me. That's when the smell hit us. I've tried many times since then to describe that smell accurately. The closest I can come is to say it was like rotten eggs mixed with spoiled meat and something else, something older and worse that had no comparison in my experience. It was the kind of smell that seemed to have weight and texture that made your brain scream wrong on a primitive level. "We should go," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew we couldn't. The sun was setting, and we were hours from anywhere that might be considered safe. We were committed now, for better or worse. Dad and Uncle Marcus set up the tents with mechanical efficiency, their movements quick and precise. I noticed they positioned them closer together than usual, and arranged them so the entrances faced each other. No one spoke about the smell, or about the deep gouges we found in the trees surrounding our campsite, marks that started at least 8 feet up the trunks. The darkness came quickly, dropping over the forest like a heavy blanket. We built a fire, but its light seemed to stop unnaturally short, as if the darkness was pushing back against it. The flames cast jumping shadows that made me think of things moving just beyond our sight. Uncle Marcus pulled out the map again, studying it in the firelight. I managed to catch a glimpse of some of the annotations this time. They weren't in English or any language I recognized. The symbols looked ancient, like something you'd find carved into cave walls. "What are those markings?" I asked. He folded the map away quickly. "Warnings," he said after a long pause. "The old hunter. He said there were things people needed to know before coming here, things his grandfather told him, and his grandfather before that." "What kinds of things?" But before he could answer, we heard it, a screech that cut through the night like a knife. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not from any animal I knew. It was high and musical and wrong, like someone had taught metal how to sing. The sound went on until I thought my eardrums would burst. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. Every natural sound had ceased. No insects, no night birds, nothing but the crack and pop of our fire. "Inside," Dad said quietly, picking up the shotgun. "Now." Sleep was impossible, but somehow I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was 2 a.m. and my bladder was screaming for relief. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Dad's steady breathing beside me, trying to convince myself I could hold it until morning. That's when I heard the branch snap. It wasn't a small sound like a squirrel or bird might make. This was the sound of something heavy moving through the forest, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. I clutched the shotgun that Dad had insisted I keep close, my palms sweaty against the wooden stock. Uncle Marcus's scream shattered the night. It came from the other tent, a sound of pure terror that made my blood run cold. Dad was awake instantly, moving with a speed I wouldn't have thought possible. I followed him out of the tent, the shotgun raised and ready. Nothing in my life, nothing in all the stories I'd heard or all the warnings we'd received, could have prepared me for what we saw. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted white fur that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But it was the details that turned my blood to ice. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but they were wrong. Too long, too jointed, horns curved up from its skull, not like a goat's horns, but like something older, something that horns had been modeled after. And its eyes. God, its eyes. They glowed red, not with reflected light, but with their own inner fire. They weren't animal eyes or even human eyes. They were something else, something that knew things, ancient things, terrible things. The creature was holding Uncle Marcus by the throat, lifting him as easily as I might lift a kitten. Marcus's feet dangled a foot off the ground, his hands clawing uselessly at the thing's arm. I didn't think. I couldn't think. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast caught the creature in the leg. It jerked back, a surprisingly human gesture, and dropped Uncle Marcus. Then it turned those burning eyes on me, and I heard its voice. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind like a nightmare-given voice. I can't remember the exact words it spoke, but I remember the feeling they gave me, like I was a mouse that had caught the attention of an owl, like I was something small and insignificant that had suddenly become prey. I fired again, the second barrel catching the creature in its chest. Dark liquid that I refused to call blood sprayed from the wound, and the thing retreated into the forest with a movement that was too smooth, too purposeful to be natural. We spent the rest of the night huddled in one tent, weapons ready, jumping at every sound. Uncle Marcus's neck was badly bruised and he couldn't speak above a whisper. Dad kept checking the wounds he'd seen me inflict on the creature, as if confirming to himself that it had been real, that something could be hurt by ordinary shot and powder. When dawn finally came, we packed with frantic speed and practically ran back to the truck. The return journey was a blur of terror and exhaustion. Every shadow might have been the creature, every sound might have been its approach. We didn't speak, couldn't speak. What was there to say about what we'd seen? The nightmares started that very night. In them I always see those eyes, feel that voice in my mind. I wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, the smell of rotting eggs and meat lingering in my nostrils. I stopped going to school for a while. How could I sit in a classroom learning about math and history when I knew what was out there? I became obsessed with research, spending countless hours online and in libraries, looking for similar encounters. I found more than I expected. Stories from all over the world about creatures that walked like men but weren't men, about things in the forest that spoke with human voices. The term goat man kept coming up, but that didn't seem right. What we'd seen was older than any modern legend, older than the words we used to describe such things. 2 weeks after our encounter, we visited my aunt and uncle's countryside home, about 3 hours from where we lived. Their property covered 5 acres of woodland, well lit with solar-powered LEDs that created a false sense of security. That night, exhausted from traveling, I went to bed early. The room was dark and I didn't bother with the light. I heard the door open at some point but assumed it was one of my cousins coming in to sleep. For hours I shared that room with something that wasn't human. It sat in the darkness, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel. When my cousin Mario finally came in and turned on the light, we both saw it. The same creature from the forest, sitting in a chair by my bed as casually as a parent watching over a sleeping child. The way it moved when it realized it had been discovered. That's what haunts me most now. It stood with terrible grace, walked to the window with perfectly human strides, and descended into the darkness below. We watched it disappear into the woods, moving with a purpose that suggested it knew exactly where it was going and what it would do when it got there. Years have passed since those encounters, but their impact remains. I still love nature, still feel drawn to the forest, but now I understand what my father meant about beauty and danger being 2 sides of the same coin. I understand why the old stories were only told at night, why some paths are marked with warnings in languages too old to read. Uncle Marcus recovered from his physical injuries, but he never went back to being a ranger. He gave me the map before he left Jamaica, moving to a city where the trees are few and the forests are far away. I keep it locked away now, but sometimes I take it out and study those ancient symbols, trying to understand what they were trying to warn us about. Dad still works as a ranger, but he stays in the safe areas now, the places where tourists go. He doesn't tell stories anymore, at least not the old ones about things in the deep forest. When people ask him why certain areas are off limits, he gives them official explanations about endangered species or unstable terrain. As for me, I've learned to live with what I know. The nightmares come less frequently now, but they haven't stopped entirely. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I think about what might have happened if Mario hadn't turned on that light. And I wonder if somewhere in the Jamaican wilderness, something with red eyes and human hands is thinking about me too. But mostly, I think about why we were there in the first place. About a 14-year-old kid who thought he knew everything about the forest because he could name the trees and track the animals. I think about how some knowledge comes at a terrible price and how some questions are better left unasked because the forest has old magic, older than nations, older than names. And sometimes when you go looking for stories, the stories come looking for you instead. The day started like any other. I was driving my old beaten-up pickup truck through the empty highways of New Mexico, the desert stretching out on both sides, nothing but scrub and dirt as far as the eye could see. The year was 1997, and I was headed back to my hometown after spending some time out west working on construction sites. My name's Darren Redhorse, and I'm full-blood Navajo. I've always been proud of my heritage, but the life I've lived, well, it's been far from easy. My mom raised me on the reservation after my dad passed, and it was tough. It's always been just her and me scraping by. I left as soon as I could, joined the Army, and spent 6 years overseas. When I came back, everything had changed. The reservation was struggling even more, and I couldn't find steady work. So I bounced around doing jobs nobody else wanted, barely getting by, but I stayed close to my mom. She's the only family I've got left. That day I was driving to visit her. She had called me 2 days before, sounding a little off, like she was nervous about something. She didn't say much, just that she wanted me to come home for a few days. I figured she just needed help with something around the house. It wasn't unusual. The road was quiet. Not a single car passed me for hours, and the sun was starting to dip in the sky when I noticed the gas light flick on. There was a station coming up in about 15 miles. I knew it well, run by an old family friend, Sam Begay. It was one of those places where you could still sit outside, sip on a Coke, and listen to stories from the locals. Sam was like an uncle to me growing up. As I drove, my mind wandered to the stories Sam used to tell. He was a repository of Navajo legends, always ready with a tale about skinwalkers, shapeshifters, or other creatures that lurked in the shadows of our world. I used to love those stories as a kid, but after what I'd seen in the Army, I'd come to realize that the real monsters in this world were human. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, the heat shimmering off the asphalt, creating mirages in the distance. I rolled down the windows, letting the warm air whip through the cab of the truck. The radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of a news broadcast talking about cattle mutilations in the area. I fiddled with the dial, trying to get a clearer signal, but gave up after a few minutes. As I approached the gas station, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The station came into view, a lone outpost in the vast expanse of the desert. Sam's old pickup was parked out front, a layer of dust on the windshield, but there was no sign of life. I pulled into the station, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place seemed deserted. Sam wasn't there, which was unusual. He was always out front, ready to greet customers with a smile and a story. The pumps were working, so I filled up the tank, the smell of gasoline sharp in the dry air. Figuring Sam must have stepped out, I went inside to pay. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was off. It smelled wrong, like something had gone bad in the heat. The aisles were all messed up, cans of beans and bags of chips scattered across the floor. "Sam?" I called out, but there was no answer. The station wasn't big, just a counter, a few rows of snacks and supplies, and a back room where Sam would sometimes nap. I checked behind the counter, thinking maybe he'd left a note or something, but there was nothing. Just silence. I was about to head back outside when I heard a sound. It was faint, coming from the back of the store near the storeroom door. It was slow, almost like breathing, but it had a wet quality to it. You know when someone's hurt bad and they're struggling to breathe? It was like that. My military training kicked in. I grabbed the tire iron from my truck and approached the storeroom door cautiously. The metal was cool in my hand, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and pushed the door open. The room was dark except for a small window near the ceiling that let in the last light of the day. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a shape on the floor. My heart sank as I recognized Sam's familiar plaid shirt. In the middle of the floor lay a body. It was Sam, face down, his legs twisted in a way that didn't look natural. I rushed over to him, but when I knelt down, I saw that it was too late. His throat had been torn open, and there was blood everywhere, pooling under him. I stood there for a second, trying to process it. Sam was dead, and whatever had done this was either long gone or still close by. The thought made my stomach drop. I backed out of the storeroom, my grip tightening on the tire iron. I needed to get out of there and call for help. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away, but I had a cell phone, though service was spotty out here. I fumbled with it, trying to dial 911, but of course there was no signal. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, like claws on concrete, coming from outside the station. My heart pounded as I slowly moved to the front of the store, keeping low. Whatever it was circling the building, and it was big. From the shadows outside, I could make out a shape moving in front of the headlights of my truck. It was huge, hunched over with thick matted fur that reminded me of a wolf, but not quite. This thing was bigger than any animal I had ever seen, its body contorting in unnatural ways, as if its limbs didn't fit right. I crouched behind the counter, barely daring to breathe, praying it wouldn't come inside. My mind raced, trying to think of what the hell could have done that to Sam. Maybe it was some kind of mutated wolf. Coyotes didn't get this big, and bears were rare in this part of the state. The scratching stopped, and for a moment everything was silent. I thought maybe it had gone. But then the door creaked open. My heart nearly stopped as the beast stepped into the store. Its head was low, sniffing the air, and I could see its jaws hanging open, blood dripping from its teeth. It was closer now, and I could see that its face was almost canine, but wrong, like something had tried to fuse a wolf with something else. The skin on its snout was stretched tight, revealing too many teeth. I didn't even breathe. The thing was sniffing the air, searching, and I knew if it got a good whiff of me, I was done. But then in the corner of the store, a can rolled off a shelf, clattering loudly to the floor. The creature snapped its head toward the noise and let out a snarl that made my stomach turn. In an instant, it bounded toward the sound, smashing into the shelves like a freight train. This was my chance. While it was distracted, I bolted for the door, running as fast as I could to the truck. I jumped in, slamming the door shut, but as I fumbled for the keys, I realized I had left them on the counter inside. My heart sank. I looked back at the store. The creature was still inside, crashing through the shelves, searching for whatever made that noise. I couldn't stay here, but I wasn't going to make it far on foot either. That's when I saw the keys to Sam's old truck hanging from a hook near the garage door. I made a run for it, ducking behind a row of fuel tanks. The truck was just a few yards away, and I could hear the thing inside, still tearing apart the store. I grabbed the keys and unlocked the truck, praying it would start. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored it, peeling out of the station and onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the beast burst through the front of the station, charging after me on all fours. It was faster than anything that size had a right to be, but I kept driving, pushing the old truck as hard as it could go. After what felt like hours, I didn't see it anymore. I made it back to town and went straight to the sheriff. I told him everything about Sam, about the creature, but when they sent a team out to the station the next day, all they found was Sam's body. The thing was gone. They believed me, though. The sheriff, a Navajo man himself, said he had heard stories from the old-timers about creatures like this, things that didn't belong to this world. He didn't give it a name, and I didn't ask. I haven't been back to that part of the desert since, but sometimes when the wind howls at night, I swear I can hear that creature's snarl, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. The image of that creature, its unnatural form and bloodied maw, haunted my dreams. I stayed with my mother, helping her around the house as I'd originally planned, but my mind was elsewhere. She could tell something was wrong. "Darren," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the desert, "what's troubling you? You've been different since you got here." I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I explain what I'd seen? How could I put into words the horror of finding Sam's body, of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist? Instead, I just shook my head. "It's nothing, Mom. Just tired from the drive." But she knew better. She always did. She reached out and took my hand, her skin weathered and wrinkled but still strong. "There are things in this world that we don't understand, Darren. Things that our ancestors knew about but that we've forgotten." I looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her eyes distant. "Your grandfather used to tell stories about shapeshifters and skinwalkers. I always thought they were just tales to scare children, but now I'm not so sure." A chill ran down my spine. "Mom, what are you saying?" She squeezed my hand. "I'm saying that whatever you saw out there, whatever happened to Sam, it might be connected to something old, something that's been asleep for a long time." I wanted to dismiss her words, to chalk it up to superstition, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. "What woke it up?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "I don't know, but there have been signs, the cattle mutilations, strange tracks in the desert, people going missing. Something's stirring out there, Darren, and I'm afraid it's only the beginning." The next day I decided to do some digging. If what my mother said was true, if there really was something out there connected to our old stories, I needed to know more. I started at the local library, poring over old newspapers and books on Navajo legends. As I researched, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades there would be a spike in strange occurrences. Livestock found torn apart, hikers disappearing without a trace, sightings of creatures that didn't match any known animal, and each time the incidents would cluster around certain areas of the desert. One name kept coming up: Chaco Canyon, an ancient site sacred to the Pueblo people, with a history stretching back over 1,000 years. According to the legends, it was a place of power, a gateway between worlds. I remembered visiting Chaco Canyon as a kid, marveling at the ancient structures and intricate petroglyphs. But now, thinking about those ruins in the context of what I'd seen, a new fear gripped me. What if those ancient people had built those structures not just as homes or ceremonial sites, but as a way to contain something? My research led me to an old man named John Sosi, a tribal elder known for his knowledge of the old ways. I found him living on the outskirts of town, in a small house surrounded by juniper trees. When I told him what I'd seen, he nodded gravely. "We have a name for creatures like the one you described," he said, his voice rough with age. "We call them Yi Nald Lushi, skinwalkers. But this one sounds different, older, more powerful." "What is it?" I asked. John's eyes met mine, and I saw fear there. "There are some things, Darren, that are better left unnamed. Naming them gives them power. But I can tell you this: what you encountered is a guardian of sorts, a protector of ancient places and old magic, and if it's awake and hunting, then something has disturbed its rest." "Chaco Canyon," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. John's eyebrows shot up. "How do you know about that?" I explained my research, the patterns I'd found. John listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each word. "You're on dangerous ground, Darren," he said when I finished. "But you might be right. There's been talk of a new development project near Chaco Canyon, some big corporation wanting to build a resort or something. If they've disturbed something they shouldn't have. He trailed off, but I understood the implication. Whatever I'd encountered at Sam's gas station might just be the beginning. Armed with this new information, I knew I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Whatever was happening, whatever had been awakened, it was connected to my people, to our land. I had a responsibility to do something about it. I told my mother I was heading back out west for work, but the truth was I was going back to where it all started. Back to Sam's gas station, and from there to Chaco Canyon. The drive back was tense. Every shadow on the road seemed to move. Every rustle in the brush along the highway made me jump. But I pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. When I reached Sam's station, the place was deserted. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, and the front of the building was still smashed in from where the creature had burst through. I parked a little way down the road and approached on foot, my heart pounding. The inside of the station was a mess, dried blood staining the floor where Sam had fallen. I stood there for a moment, remembering my old friend, and silently promised him that I'd get to the bottom of this. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, half hidden under a fallen shelf, was a scrap of paper. I picked it up, my hands shaking slightly. It was a receipt, but not from the gas station. It was for a construction company, Red Rock Development Corp., with an address near Chaco Canyon. This had to be connected to what John had told me about the development project. I pocketed the receipt and headed back to my truck. As I drove towards Chaco Canyon, the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. I knew I was driving towards danger, towards something ancient and powerful that had already killed once. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever was out there, whatever had been awakened, it was a threat to everything and everyone I cared about. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I didn't know what I'd find at Chaco Canyon, but I was determined to face it. For Sam, for my people, and for the desert itself. The road stretched out before me, leading into the heart of the ancient lands, and somewhere out there, in the gathering darkness, I knew the creature was waiting. As I approached Chaco Canyon, the landscape became increasingly rugged. The road wound through towering mesas and deep arroyos, the ancient structures of the ancestral Puebloans looming in the distance. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. I parked my truck near the visitor center, which was closed at this late hour. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional cry of a coyote in the distance. I grabbed my flashlight and a backpack with some water and supplies, then set out towards the heart of the ruins. The great houses of Chaco Canyon stood like sentinels in the moonlight. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the structures, was a maze of stone walls and empty windows. As I walked through the ancient city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pulled out the receipt I'd found at Sam's gas station and studied the address again. The construction site should be just beyond the protected area of the park. As I hiked in that direction, I noticed something odd. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading off the main road and into a narrow canyon. Following the tracks, I soon came upon a makeshift camp. Construction equipment sat idle in the moonlight, and a few temporary buildings had been set up. But something was wrong. The camp was deserted, and there were signs of a struggle. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, and... was that blood on the ground? My heart raced as I investigated further. In one of the buildings, I found a stack of documents, plans for a resort complex, environmental impact studies, and my blood ran cold. There was a map of the canyon, with certain areas marked in red. One of them corresponded to where Sam's gas station had been. Suddenly, a low growl broke the silence. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the edge of the camp, stood the creature. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. In the moonlight, I could see that its fur was patchy, revealing leathery skin underneath. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The creature took a step forward, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the earth. Then, to my horror, it began to change. Its form shifted and twisted, becoming more humanoid. Within moments, a man stood where the beast had been. But his eyes were still those of the creature. "You should not have come here, Darren Redhorse," the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The man or creature, I wasn't sure what to call it anymore, took another step towards me. "How do you know my name?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The being tilted its head, a gesture that was disturbingly inhuman despite its now human form. "I know many things, Darren. I have watched your people for centuries. I have protected these lands since before your ancestors first set foot here." My mind reeled. This thing, this shapeshifter, was claiming to be some kind of ancient guardian? "Protected?" I spat out. "You killed Sam. You've been terrorizing people." A look of what might have been sadness crossed the being's face. Samuel Begay was an unfortunate necessity. He discovered something he should not have. As for the others, I do what I must to keep the ancient powers contained. I glanced at the documents I'd found. "What does this construction have to do with it? Why are you attacking these sites?" The being's eyes flashed, a hint of its bestial nature showing through. "The fools who would build here do not understand what they are disturbing. Beneath this land lie forces beyond their comprehension. The great houses, the kivas, they were not just dwellings and ceremonial sites. They were prisons, Darren. Prisons for things that should never again walk this earth." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered John Sosie's words about Chaco Canyon being a gateway between worlds. "What kind of things?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. The being's form shimmered as if it was struggling to maintain its human shape. Gods, demons, creatures from the stars. The names do not matter. What matters is that they remain bound. But the digging, the construction, it weakens the seals. Already some have begun to stir. I thought of the cattle mutilations, the missing people. "That was you, trying to stop the construction?" The being nodded. "I am the last of the guardians, Darren. The old ways are forgotten, the rituals to keep the binding strong lost to time. I do what I can, but I am limited." "Limited how?" I asked, my fear slowly being replaced by a morbid curiosity. The being's form shimmered again, and for a moment I saw the beast beneath. "The price of immortality is high, Darren. To maintain my vigil I must feed on flesh and fear. It is not a choice I made lightly, but it is necessary." I felt sick. This thing, this guardian, had been killing people like Sam, to fuel its own existence. But if what it was saying was true, the alternative could be far worse. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked. The being's eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of centuries in them. "Because you are of the people, Darren. You carry the old blood. And because I am tired, so very tired." As the implications of the guardian's words sank in, I felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on my shoulders. This being, this shapeshifter, had killed my friend. It had terrorized my people for who knows how long. Every instinct told me it was a monster that needed to be stopped. But if what it was saying was true, if it really was the only thing standing between our world and forces of unimaginable horror, "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The guardian's form shimmered again, and I caught glimpses of other shapes, a coyote, an eagle, a bear, before it settled back into its human guise. "I offer you a choice, Darren Redhorse. Join me, become a guardian. With your help we can stop this construction, reinforce the bindings, and keep the ancient evils at bay." I stared at the being in disbelief. "Become like you, a killer?" The guardian shook its head. "Not necessarily. The old ways are not entirely lost. With study, with dedication, we might find another way. But it will not be an easy path. You will have to leave your old life behind." I thought of my mother, of the life I'd been trying to build. Could I really give all that up? But then I thought of Sam, of the wider consequences if this being was telling the truth. And if I refuse? I asked. The guardian's eyes hardened. Then I will do what I must, alone, and I cannot promise that your people will be spared in the conflict to come. I closed my eyes, trying to think. Part of me wanted to run, to dismiss this all as the ravings of a monster trying to justify its actions. But deep down I knew that what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, was only the tip of something much larger and more terrifying. If I agree, I said slowly, I want your word that no more innocent people will die. We find another way. The guardian nodded solemnly. You have my word, Darren Redhorse. We will seek an alternative path. But know this, the road ahead will be long and fraught with danger. The forces we stand against are patient, but they are also relentless. I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would change my life forever. Then I accept. Teach me. Show me how to be a guardian. A look of relief passed over the being's face, so human in that moment that it was hard to reconcile with the monstrous form I'd seen earlier. Thank you, Darren. You have made a wise choice, though I know it does not feel that way now. As if to emphasize the gravity of the moment, a tremor passed through the earth. In the distance I heard what sounded like stone grinding against stone. The guardian's head snapped up, its eyes wide with alarm. It's starting. We must hurry. Your training begins now, Darren. Are you ready? I nodded, pushing aside my fear and doubt. Whatever was coming, whatever ancient horrors were stirring beneath Chaco Canyon, I had made my choice. I would stand against them, learn the old ways, and protect my people, protect the world, no matter the cost. As we moved deeper into the canyon, the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. The guardian began to shift forms again, this time taking on the shape of a massive owl. It spread its wings, beckoning me to follow. I cast one last look back at the construction camp, at the world I was leaving behind. Then, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead, I followed the guardian into the heart of Chaco Canyon, towards a destiny I could never have imagined. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and wonder. The guardian, who told me to call him Neil, though I suspected this wasn't his true name, began my training immediately. We moved through the canyon like shadows, always staying one step ahead of the construction crews and the park rangers. Neil taught me the secret paths through the desert, showing me how to move without leaving tracks, how to blend with the landscape until I was nearly invisible. But more importantly, he began teaching me the old ways, the forgotten lore of my people. The power is in the land, Neil explained as we sat atop a mesa watching the sunrise. It flows through the rocks, the plants, the very air we breathe. Your ancestors knew how to tap into this power, how to use it to maintain the balance. I listened intently, trying to absorb every word. It was hard to reconcile this patient teacher with the terrifying creature I'd first encountered, but I was beginning to understand the complexity of Neol's existence. But how does this help us stop whatever's trying to break free? I asked. Neol's eyes, currently those of an eagle, fixed on me. The bindings that hold the ancient ones are not just physical, Darren. They are woven into the very fabric of this place. By learning to sense and manipulate the land's energy, we can strengthen those bindings. He instructed me to close my eyes and place my hands on the sun-warmed stone. Feel the pulse of the earth, he said. Listen to its rhythm. At first I felt nothing, but as the minutes ticked by, I began to sense something. A faint thrumming like a distant heartbeat, and with it came flashes of memory, images of ancient peoples, of rituals performed under starlit skies, of battles fought against shadowy, monstrous forms. I gasped and pulled my hands away. What was that? Neol nodded approvingly. You're beginning to see, to feel. The land remembers, Darren. It carries the echoes of all that has happened here. In time, you'll learn to interpret these echoes, to use them to guide your actions. As the days passed, my senses sharpened. I began to perceive the world in ways I never had before. The desert came alive with unseen currents of energy, and I learned to draw upon this energy, to shape it with my will. But it wasn't all mystical training. Niol also taught me practical skills, how to track, how to fight, how to survive in the harshest conditions. A guardian must be prepared for anything, he said. One night, as we sat around a small hidden fire, I finally asked the question that had been gnawing at me. Niol, how did you become what you are? The guardian was silent for a long moment, his form shifting restlessly between human and animal shapes. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. I was once like you, Darren, a young warrior of my people, chosen to undergo the guardian ritual. But something went wrong. The power, it was too much. It changed me, twisted me into something between man and beast. For a long time I raged against what I had become, but eventually I understood the necessity of my transformation. I listened, transfixed, as Niol recounted centuries of standing watch, of fighting back the darkness that constantly threatened to spill into our world. His tale was one of sacrifice, of unimaginable loneliness, but also of unwavering purpose. As he finished, I felt a mix of awe and sadness. Will I become like you? I asked hesitantly. Niol shook his head. No, Darren, your path will be different. You are of a new generation with new strengths. You will face your own trials, but you need not fear the fate that befell me. His words were reassuring, but as I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my trials were only just beginning. Weeks passed and I immersed myself in my training. The outside world felt distant, almost unreal. My mother must be worried sick, I knew, but I couldn't risk contacting her. Not yet. Not until I understood more, until I was sure I could protect her. Niol and I moved through the canyons and mesas like ghosts, always watching, always listening. We sabotaged construction equipment when we could, misdirected survey teams, did everything possible to slow the progress of the Red Rock Development Corps. But despite our efforts, the work continued, and with each passing day I could feel something growing stronger, a presence vast and alien, stirring in the depths beneath Chaco Canyon. One night I was jolted awake by a tremor that shook the earth. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Niol was already up, his form flickering between shapes as if he couldn't maintain any single one. It's time, he said grimly. They're making their move. We raced through the darkness towards the main construction site. As we crested a rise, I saw a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The site was ablaze with unnatural light. Workers ran screaming as the ground beneath their feet writhed and buckled. And there, at the center of it all, was a hole. A pit that seemed to go down forever, pulsing with a sickly, otherworldly glow. Standing at the edge of the pit was a man in an expensive suit, the CEO of Red Rock Development, I guessed. But something was wrong with him. His eyes glowed with the same light as the pit, and his mouth was stretched in a rictus grin that was too wide, too full of teeth to be human. Fool, Niol growled. He thinks he can control them, use their power. He has no idea what he's unleashing. As we watched in horror, a shape began to emerge from the pit. It was vast, defying description. Tentacles, wings, eyes, all shifting and changing, never settling into any recognizable form. The very air seemed to warp around it. What do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. Niol turned to me, his eyes blazing with an inner fire. Remember your training, Darren. Remember the power of this land. We are the Guardians. We stand between this world and the chaos that would consume it. Are you ready? I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of generations of Guardians who had come before me. I reached out with my senses, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath my feet, the whispers of ancient power in the air. I'm ready, I said, and I meant it. Together Niol and I began to chant, calling upon the power of the land, the strength of our ancestors. The air around us began to shimmer as we wove a barrier of energy, pushing back against the emerging horror. The creature from the pit roared, a sound that threatened to shatter my sanity. The possessed CEO turned towards us, his inhuman grin widening impossibly further. You're too late, he said, his voice echoing with otherworldly harmonics. "The gateway is open. They are coming through. This world will be remade in their image." Niol snarled, his form expanding into something massive and terrifying, a fusion of all his animal aspects into one incredible being. "Not while we stand, abomination." As Niol leaped towards the monstrous entity emerging from the pit, I focused all my energy on maintaining our protective barrier. The air crackled with power, ancient symbols flickering in and out of existence around us. The creature lashed out with impossibly long limbs, each movement distorting the very fabric of reality. Niol met its attack with primal fury, his form constantly shifting to match each new threat. They clashed in a battle that defied comprehension, a whirlwind of teeth, claws, and otherworldly. Meanwhile, I found myself facing the possessed CEO. He advanced on me, that inhuman grin never leaving his face. "Join us, young guardian," he said, his voice a cacophony of whispers. "Embrace the chaos. Become a god." I stood my ground, drawing upon every lesson Niol had taught me. "I am Darren Redhorse," I declared, my voice stronger than I felt. "I am a guardian of this land, and you are not welcome here." With those words, I felt something unlock within me. The power of the land surged through my body, and suddenly I could see the threads of energy connecting everything, the rocks, the air, the ancient structures of Chaco Canyon. And I could see how to weave those threads into a weapon. I began to chant in a language I didn't know I remembered, my hands moving in intricate patterns. The possessed CEO's smile faltered as he felt the power building around me. He lunged forward, but it was too late. A blast of pure energy erupted from my hands, catching him square in the chest. He flew backwards, his body disintegrating into motes of sickly light that were quickly swallowed by the darkness. I turned my attention to the pit, where Niol was still locked in combat with the emerging entity. Despite his incredible power, I could see that Niol was being slowly overwhelmed. The creature was simply too vast, too alien for any single being to defeat. But we were not alone. As I reached out with my newfound senses, I felt the presence of countless others, the spirits of guardians past, the echoes of ancient rituals, the very soul of the land itself. All of it was there, waiting to be called upon. "Niol," I shouted, "the binding! We need to remake the binding!" Understanding flashed in his eyes. With a monumental effort, he disengaged from the creature and fell back to my side. Together, we began to chant, our voices joining with those of 1,000 generations of guardians. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the power of our ritual. Strands of energy began to coalesce around the pit, weaving together into an intricate net. The emerging entity roared in defiance, thrashing against the forming barriers, but it was too late. With a final surge of power, the binding snapped into place. The creature was drawn back into the pit, its unearthly screams fading as reality knitted itself back together. The unnatural light dimmed, then winked out entirely, leaving us in the soft pre-dawn glow of the desert. For a long moment, neither Niol nor I moved, scarcely daring to believe it was over. Then, slowly, Niol's form shimmered and settled into his human aspect. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and sadness. "It's done," he said softly. "The binding is remade, stronger than before. But our work is not over, Darren. It never will be." I nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility I had accepted. "What now?" I asked. Niol gestured to the construction site, now eerily silent and still. "We clean up. We make sure no trace of what happened here remains. And then we watch. We wait. We stand ready for the next threat, whatever form it may take." As the sun rose over Chaco Canyon, Niol and I set about our task. We buried the pit, erased all signs of the eldritch horror that had nearly been unleashed. To the outside world, it would appear as if the Red Rock Development Project had simply been abandoned, another failed venture in the harsh desert landscape. In the days that followed, I returned home briefly. I hugged my mother, told her I loved her, and tried to explain that I had found my purpose, even if I couldn't fully describe what that purpose was. It was hard, leaving her again, but I knew it was necessary. Neol and I established a network of guardians, recruiting others who showed sensitivity to the old ways. We became the silent protectors of the Southwest, standing watch against threats most of the world would never know existed. Years passed. I aged, but slowly, the power I had embraced granting me a measure of Neol's longevity. I saw the world change, saw my people face new challenges and triumphs. Through it all, I remained true to my calling. Sometimes, on quiet nights beneath the vast desert sky, I think back to that fateful day at Sam's gas station. I mourn for the life I left behind, for the normal existence I might have had. But then I feel the pulse of the land beneath my feet, sense the ancient power that flows through this timeless landscape, and I know I made the right choice. I am Darren Redhorse, guardian of the desert, protector of the old ways, and as long as I draw breath, I will stand against the darkness that threatens to consume us all. I never really bought into all that paranormal stuff. My name's Otis Drexel, and I've been working in the missing persons unit for a good chunk of my life, 23 years to be exact. My job is to find people who seem to have vanished off the face of the earth. Most times it's just folks getting lost, having accidents, or sadly deciding to disappear on their own. But this one case, it still doesn't sit right with me. It was a Friday, I think, May 15th, 2022. The kind of spring morning where the air still has a bite to it, reminding you that summer isn't quite ready to take over yet. I was at my desk sipping my third cup of coffee and reviewing some case files when my phone rang. "Drexel," I answered, my voice still gravelly from lack of sleep. "Detective Drexel, this is Ranger Johnson from Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We've got a situation here that might require your expertise." I sat up straighter, my interest piqued. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was a popular spot, but also vast and wild enough to swallow a person whole. We'd had our fair share of cases there over the years. "What's the situation, Ranger?" "We've got a missing camper, Rachel Pollard, 28 years old. Her boyfriend reported her missing early this morning. Says they had a fight last night and she stormed off. When he went looking for her hours later, there was no trace." I jotted down the details in my notebook, my mind already racing through the possibilities. "Any signs of foul play?" "None that we can see, but we haven't done a thorough search yet. The boyfriend seems pretty shaken up." I glanced at my watch, 10:46 a.m. "All right, I'm on my way. Keep the boyfriend there and don't let anyone contaminate the scene." I hung up, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. As I drove towards the park, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the dense trees and rolling hills. The air was crisp with that unique smell of pine and earth you only get in places like this. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in my gut. I arrived at the park ranger station just after noon. Ranger Johnson met me at the entrance, a tall, weathered man with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. "Detective Drexel," he greeted me with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming so quickly. The boyfriend's inside. Name's Mark Henson. He's pretty worked up." I nodded, following Johnson into the station. In the small waiting area sat a scrawny guy with a guilty look on his face. He was pale and jittery, which wasn't unusual for someone whose loved one was missing, but something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. "Mr. Henson?" I approached him, flashing my badge. "I'm Detective Otis Drexel. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Rachel's disappearance." Mark looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. "Yeah, okay, whatever helps find her." I sat down across from him, pulling out my notebook. "Walk me through what happened last night. You said you had an argument?" Mark nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Yeah, we've been having some problems lately. Rachel's been distant, you know. Last night I confronted her about it. Things got heated." "What time was this?" "Around 9 p.m., I think. We'd just finished dinner at our campsite." I jotted this down. "And then what happened?" Mark's voice trembled slightly as he continued. We argued, yes, she was really upset. She said she needed space, and then she just walked into the woods. I thought she'd cool off and come back, but she didn't. I looked for hours, but it's like she just disappeared. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. Anyone else around? Anything unusual you noticed? Mark shook his head. Just us. We didn't see anyone. Our campsite is pretty isolated. What was Rachel wearing when she left? Jeans, hiking boots, and a red fleece jacket. She had her phone with her, but it's going straight to voicemail now. I made a note of the description. And you waited until this morning to report her missing? Mark's eyes darted away from mine. I thought she'd come back. I kept looking for her all night. When she didn't show up by dawn, I hiked back to get help. Something about his story didn't quite add up, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I'd seen enough cases to know that the person closest to the victim is often involved, but I'd also seen enough to know that sometimes terrible things just happen. All right, Mr. Henson, we're going to do everything we can to find Rachel. I need you to stay here at the station in case we have any more questions. Can you do that? He nodded, looking relieved to be done with the interview for now. I stepped outside with Ranger Johnson, the cool air a welcome relief after the stuffy interior of the station. What do you think? Johnson asked, his eyes scanning the tree line as if Rachel might suddenly appear. Hard to say at this point, I replied. His story seems shaky, but that could just be stress. We need to get a search team out there ASAP. The first 48 hours are crucial in these cases. Johnson nodded. I've already called in some extra rangers. We can be ready to go in 30 minutes. Good. Let's get moving. As we prepared for the search, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. Little did I know, this case was about to take me down a path I never expected, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The search team assembled quickly, a mix of park rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers. I went over the map with them, marking out the area where Rachel was last seen. Her campsite was located in a less frequented part of the park, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. Remember, I addressed the group, we're looking for any signs of Rachel Pollard. Clothing, personal items, tracks, anything out of the ordinary. If you find something, don't touch it. Mark the location and radio it in immediately. We spread out, each team taking a different section of the search grid. I paired up with Ranger Johnson, heading towards the area where Mark claimed Rachel had walked off. You'd be amazed at how quickly a person can vanish in the wilderness. The dense foliage and winding trails make it a real maze. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the canopy above grew thicker, casting long shadows across our path. How often do you get missing persons cases out here? I asked Johnson as we carefully scanned the ground for any signs of disturbance. More often than we'd like, he replied, his voice low. Most of the time it's just hikers who've gotten turned around. We find them within a day or two, dehydrated and scared, but alive. And the other times... Johnson's face darkened. Sometimes we don't find them at all. The forest, it can be unforgiving. We continued in silence after that, the weight of his words hanging in the air between us. Hours passed and we found nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to indicate Rachel had ever been there. As the afternoon wore on, I met up with 2 other rangers, Ted and Lisa, who had been searching a particularly thick part of the forest. Anything? I asked, hoping for a lead. Nothing, Otis, Lisa replied, wiping sweat from her brow. It's like she vanished into thin air. We decided to take a break and regroup. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. It's something you get used to in my line of work, but it doesn't mean it's not unsettling. The stillness can play tricks on your mind. As we sat there, catching our breath and comparing notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. But there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. We should head back soon, Johnson said, checking his watch. It'll be dark in a couple of hours. I nodded, but I was reluctant to give up. Something about this case had gotten under my skin. Let's do one more sweep. There's a small trail over there that we haven't checked yet. The others agreed, and we set off towards the narrow path I'd spotted. It was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it drew me in. As we made our way down the trail, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the silence more pronounced. It felt like stepping into another world. We were about half a mile in when I saw something strange, a clearing up ahead bathed in an eerie light that seemed out of place in the dense forest. I held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing towards the unnatural glow. Johnson squinted, then nodded. "What the hell is that?" Carefully, we approached the edge of the clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, ancient-looking and covered in moss. And in the middle of that circle— "Oh my God," Lisa gasped. There, sprawled out in the center of the stone circle, was Rachel Pollard. Her eyes were open but lifeless, her body unnaturally twisted. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries. She was just dead. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. As I knelt beside her to check for any signs of life, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the silence. "Damn it," I muttered, my nerves on edge. I reached for my radio to call it in, but as I did, I noticed something clutched in Rachel's hand. It was a small, smooth stone, unlike any I'd seen in the area. There was something etched into its surface, but I couldn't make it out in the fading light. As I pocketed the stone, intending to examine it more closely later, the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The forest had revealed one secret, but it was holding on to many more. And as the sun set on that first day of the investigation, I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how it would change everything I thought I knew about the world. We secured the area and began the process of documenting the scene. As we worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. But there was never anything there, just the endless expanse of trees and the growing darkness. The medical examiner arrived about an hour later, looking as unsettled as the rest of us. Dr. Maria Suarez, a seasoned professional I'd worked with on numerous cases, knelt beside Rachel's body, her face a mask of concentration. "What do you think, Doc?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "I can't say for certain without a full autopsy, but there's no apparent cause of death, no marks, no wounds, nothing. It's as if she just stopped living." A chill ran down my spine at her words. In all my years on the job, I'd never encountered anything like this. We were packing up to leave when Ted called out, "Otis, over here, you need to see this." I walked over to where he was standing, just outside the clearing. There, partially hidden under a fallen tree, was another body. This one was older, much older. The clothes were tattered and the remains skeletal. "This just keeps getting better," I said, sarcasm masking my unease. The discovery of the second body changed everything. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore, it was something much darker. We called in more teams, and soon the area was swarming with personnel. The skeletal remains were carefully excavated and sent to the lab for analysis. As night fell, the park took on an even more sinister tone. The rangers set up a perimeter and we camped out, unwilling to leave the scene unattended. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions and theories. What had happened to Rachel? And what about the old remains? It didn't make sense. People don't just die for no reason. Around midnight, as I sat by the campfire, I heard a low, almost inaudible hum. It seemed to come from all around us, reverberating through the trees. I looked at Ted and Lisa, but they were deep in conversation, oblivious to the sound. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and walked towards the edge of the clearing. The hum grew louder, more insistent. I shone the light into the woods, half expecting to see something watching me, but there was nothing. "Everything okay, Otis?" Johnson's voice made me jump. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I replied, trying to sound casual. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the feeling of unease never left. By morning, we were all eager to get back to the main station and report our findings. As we packed up, I remembered the strange stone I'd found in Rachel's hand. I pulled it out of my pocket, turning it over in the morning light. The etching was clearer now, but I still couldn't make sense of it. It looked like some kind of symbol, ancient and worn. "Hey, Ted, take a look at this," I called out. He walked over, squinting at the stone. "What do you think it is?" "No idea, but it feels out of place," I said, pocketing the stone again. "Let's get it back to the lab, see if they can make anything of it." We made our way back to the park's main office, the events of the past day weighing heavily on us. Rachel's body was taken to the morgue, and the skeletal remains were sent for further analysis. I handed the stone over to our forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. As I sat down to write up my preliminary report, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just scratching the surface of something much bigger. The forest had given up 2 of its secrets, but I had a sinking feeling there were many more to uncover. Little did I know, this case was about to take me down a rabbit hole of ancient mysteries and unspeakable horrors. The Great Smoky Mountains held secrets that defied explanation, and I was about to come face to face with something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. Days turned into weeks, and the case only grew stranger. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death for Rachel. Her body showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of drug use, nothing to explain why a healthy 28-year-old woman would suddenly drop dead in the middle of the forest. The skeletal remains were identified as belonging to a hiker who had gone missing over a decade ago. His case had gone cold, written off as another unfortunate soul lost to the wilderness. But now, finding him in the same spot as Rachel, it seemed like too much of a coincidence. And then there was the stone. Our forensics team couldn't make heads or tails of it. It wasn't from any local geology, and the markings didn't match any known language or symbols. It was as if it had appeared out of thin air, just like our victims had vanished. I spent countless hours poring over old case files looking for any connections, and then I found it. A series of disappearances dating back decades, all in the same area of the park. All unsolved, all with no trace of the missing persons ever found. One night, as I was going over the files for what felt like the 100th time, my phone rang. It was Lisa, one of the rangers who had been with me when we found Rachel. "Otis," her voice was shaky, "you need to come to the park, now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my coat and drove out to the park, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Lisa was waiting for me, her face pale in the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just follow me," she said, leading me into the woods. We walked in silence, the darkness pressing in around us. The familiar hum I'd heard that first night seemed to grow louder with each step. Lisa led me to the same clearing where we'd found Rachel. In the center was another circle of stones, and in the middle another body. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The body was that of a man, his face contorted in a look of sheer terror. He was dressed in hiking gear, and from the looks of it, he hadn't been dead long. "We found him this morning," Lisa said quietly. "No ID, no belongings, just dead." I knelt beside the body, examining it closely. There were no visible injuries, just like Rachel. But this time there was something different. In the man's hand was a piece of paper, tightly clenched. I pried it loose, my hands trembling. The paper was old and worn, but the writing was clear. It was a map with the clearing marked in red, and beneath it a single word: "Beware." I stood up, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the trees and the silence. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We made our way back to the main office, the weight of the new discovery heavy on our shoulders. I handed the map over to the forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The new body was identified as another missing hiker, his case also long cold. The map was examined, but it didn't match any known trails or landmarks. It was as if it was drawn by someone who knew the forest intimately, but not in any official capacity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, something ancient and malevolent. The stone, the bodies, the map. They were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. It was during a late-night research session that I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old journal, buried deep in the park's archives, written by one of the original surveyors of the area in the late 1800s. The journal spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, unexplained disappearances, eerie sounds, and most disturbingly, a clearing with a circle of stones that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The surveyor wrote of a local Cherokee legend about a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where dark spirits could cross over and take the unwary. The description matched our clearing perfectly. I knew then that we were dealing with something beyond the realm of normal police work, but I also knew that I couldn't just walk away. Too many people had vanished, too many families were left without answers. I gathered a team of trusted colleagues, including Ted and Lisa, and we set out for the clearing once more. This time we were prepared, or so we thought. We had cameras, recording equipment, and enough supplies to last days. As we entered the clearing, the air grew heavy with tension. We set up our equipment, documenting everything meticulously. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. And then, just as the sun began to set, we heard it. The low hum growing louder and more insistent. We looked around, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the darkness closing in. Suddenly the ground beneath us began to tremble. The stones in the circle glowed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows on the trees. And then, in the center of the circle, a figure appeared. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved with an eerie grace, its limbs long and thin. It looked at us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, and the ground beneath us began to crack. We stumbled back, trying to keep our footing. "Otis, what do we do?" Lisa shouted, her voice filled with fear. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing her arm. We ran, the ground cracking and shaking beneath us. The hum grew louder, almost deafening. I glanced back and saw the figure watching us, its eyes glowing brighter. We burst out of the clearing and into the forest, the ground still trembling. We didn't stop running until we reached the main office, our hearts pounding and our minds reeling. We reported everything, but no one believed us. The footage we recorded was mysteriously corrupted. The maps we found were dismissed as hoaxes. It was as if the forest itself was hiding the truth. Rachel's case remained unsolved, her death a mystery. The old remains and the new body were buried, their stories forgotten. But I knew there was something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent. In the months that followed, I tried to move on, to focus on other cases. But the events of that day haunted me. The forest had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. I still have the stone, a small, smooth reminder of the unknown. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low, insistent hum echoing through the silence. The Great Smoky Mountains keep their secrets well, but for those who know where to look, the signs are there. A warning to the curious, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. As for me, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that there are things in this world that defy explanation. But I can't help but wonder, as I look out at the distant mountains, how many more souls the forest will claim before its hunger is satisfied.